Good morning and welcome to this special edition of the WTR Small Cap Spotlight. I'm your host, Shawn Severson, founding partner and CEO at Water Tower Research. Joining me today is Peter Gastreich, who's our WTR Senior Energy and Sustainability Analyst here at Water Tower Research. Peter, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shawn. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to our chat.
So, Peter, for the audience today, Peter is going to take us through his recent WTR industry report titled What Carbon Capture and Storage Could Mean for US Ethanol-Based Biofuels. As a reminder, you can access this report on our website at www.watertowerresearch.com. We're an open access research platform, so it's non-permission. So we encourage you to take a look there at this report, as well as several of the other reports that Peter and our other senior analysts have written. Peter, let's kick off with a broad top-down question here. Can you let us know why you chose this topic for your report and why investors should care about carbon capture and storage with respect to ethanol and particularly sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF?
Sure, Shawn. There's a few reasons, and we can talk about these in more detail. But for starters, number one, this is a big growth opportunity. Now in the US, you have 5 operational ethanol carbon capture and storage, or CCS, facilities. These facilities have a combined total capacity for nearly 3 million tons of CO2 annually. Now, in terms of the planned projects and capacity that involve ethanol or sustainable aviation fuel, that number is about 10 times the existing operational capacity, or about 30 million tons of CO2 annually. So there is growth out there. And moreover, there are listed companies that make the theme investable, and we include write-ups of 8 companies in our report. The second thing to point out is that ethanol carbon capture is among the lowest cost CCS applications. So some of those applications that are responsible for much larger CO2 emissions, like power generation, cement production, and so forth, those happen to be prohibitively expensive to capture. This is why ethanol CCS, and I'd say ammonia CCS as well, have better prospects and are seeing much more interest now. And third, while investors perceive a lot of uncertainty with the renewable energy policies under review by the Trump administration, we just see so much evidence that ethanol, carbon capture, and sustainable aviation fuel will be supported. Clearly, the view on climate change is not something that's going to be a driver here. Drivers are the benefits to the rural economy and maximizing so-called energy dominance. I think the US wants to be a relevant and competitive producer of products like sustainable aviation fuel that are globally relevant and where the US can benefit as a competitive supplier using homegrown crops and homegrown technology. And looping back, ethanol carbon capture and sequestration can play a big role in enabling that opportunity for the US. So I'll just add here that what is also lost on a lot of investors when thinking about the policy risk is a potential willingness for customers who are buying this stuff to pay for the carbon abatement properties of the fuel. So we've discussed in previous research how SAF offtake contracts are in some cases being structured for airline customers to absorb some of this policy risk, and so to ensure that these projects can move forward. So Shawn, there's really, there's a lot for investors to sink their teeth into with this report, and this is a good place for them to start their due diligence process.
And I think it's forgotten sometimes that this is an America First policy, right? They're talking about homegrown agriculture, feeding into the local economies, supporting rural communities and farmers. So, I know there's a lot of push and shove going on the policy side around this, but as you mentioned and pointed out, this is a very domestic strong policy as in supporting ag all the way through, low carbon ethanol and into SAF. So great topic, great report. Let's talk about a little context on ethanol. You mentioned that this is important for rural economies, and as I just noted, but let's dig into that a little bit deeper and provide a bit of context for this of just how important it is to the rural communities in the United States.
Sure, Shawn. Yeah, ethanol is hugely important to farmers and to rural economies. Of course, everyone sees ethanol all the time. Unless you're driving an EV, you're putting ethanol in your car pretty much every time you go to the pump. If you look in the US, for example, ethanol now makes up around 10% of the total gasoline pool. So that means there's about 16 billion gallons of ethanol that's produced every year and used as fuel. Now, where is all that ethanol coming from? Well, the feedstock mostly originates from corn farmers in the Midwest. about 1/3 of the corn crop is used to produce ethanol. That's not all you get from the corn. You have co-products like protein and fiber, animal feed, corn oil, and to the extent that we can now consider CO2 a co-product, well, you've got that too now. The U.S. has close to 200 ethanol biorefineries, which are mostly located in the Midwest corn growing regions. We talk about the production process in the report, so I'd refer there. But the key to the process is fermenting the starch contained in kernels of corn and thereby producing alcohol or ethanol. So this is clearly a big farm to fuel supply chain. A lot of crops, a lot of equipment, and probably the best way to quantify the importance would be, to put the ethanol industry in the context of the national farming GDP. So the ethanol industry, and that's including the corn farming component of it, contributes to about 25 to 30% of national farming GDP. So Shawn, this should indicate that there's a lot of economic interest here, a lot of political interest in sustaining and then further growing that ethanol economy, and low carbon ethanol with CCS could be so supportive of that growth.
Let's talk about CO2 as a co-product. You mentioned that that's really a co-product in today's production of ethanol from a CO2 emissions perspective. Let's address the life cycle of ethanol and how should we think about the sources and uses of CO2 emissions and where carbon capture can come into play here.
Okay, sure. Yeah. I think one of the, when compared to fossil fuels, and this is something people don't really think about a lot, but the ultimate benefit really from a CO2 emissions standpoint is that the growing of the corn itself is absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. So beyond that, the challenge comes in controlling the emissions along the production process and supply chain, going from corn to fermentation to ethanol, transportation, or into SAF in some cases, or ultimately the consumption as a fuel and the burning of the fuel. But now in the entire ethanol supply chain from farm to fuel, the number one source of emissions outside of the fuel combustion itself in your car, aircraft, or whatever is the fermentation process in the ethanol biorefinery. This is also the point along the supply chain where carbon capture is applied. Now, the CO2 emissions from the fermentation process are equal to about 2/3 of the total cumulative life cycle emissions of ethanol. And there's pluses and minuses along the way, and we've got a great figure you can take a look in the report for this in terms of positive and negative contributions to that net emissions. But the life cycle, as I mentioned, goes from growing corn, which absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, to producing ethanol and combusting the fuel, which obviously contributes to the emissions. But again, take a look at figure 4. But so Shawn, anyway, the main point here is that there's a high concentration of emissions from the fermentation itself, which is equal to nearly 2/3 of that total life cycle emissions. And that makes ethanol a great candidate for lower cost carbon capture.
So, Peter, let's discuss the economics. You mentioned the CCS ethanol is relatively low cost. Can you get a bit more specific?
Sure. Unfortunately for CO2 emissions as such, the biggest emitters are also the ones that are the most expensive to apply carbon capture to. In researching our report, we found that the cost of applying carbon capture to power generation and cement production range from $50 up to $120 per ton. That's for the capture alone. Never mind about transporting and injecting the CO2. This adds even more to the cost. Ethanol, it turns out, is relatively inexpensive, ranging at just around $20 to $30 per ton to capture those CO2 emissions. This is due to a relatively higher concentration or purity of the CO2 in this form when compared to other source emitters. While ammonia is not really the focus of this report, but it's also relatively less expensive, and this just goes back to why you're seeing projects, emerging in this area. Again, you do have costs to shoulder for both transport and storage. So to make this highly lucrative, you either need to have the sequestration capability on site, as in the example of Gevo's Red Trail asset in North Dakota, or you need to have a high volume and significantly scaled pipeline and sequestration infrastructure, which is serving your ethanol refinery. This would be like the example of, Green Plains in Nebraska. At any rate, the $20 to $30 cost for carbon capture compares favorably to relevant tax credits like the 45Q carbon capture credit, and also works with the 45Z clean fuel production credit. So Shawn, that $20 to $30 cost for ethanol CCS leaves significant wiggle room when it comes to those transport and storage costs.
Thanks, Peter. So fermentation, as you noted, is the biggest part of the CO2 emissions and the target for carbon capture. Can you spend a moment and talk about other ways to reduce CO2 emissions outside of carbon capture as we know it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, probably the lowest hanging fruit is going to be on the climate smart agriculture side. So for the growers, we've hosted a symposium. We had a company, Continuum Ag, with us in December, and they brought us through some really good numbers for how all of this works and how it's tracked and so forth. But these include practices like cover crops, utilizing manure, reducing tillage, and using less synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. Ethanol refineries also burn fossil fuels like natural gas in the process. So to solve for this, these processes can use renewable natural gas, or the process can also be electrified, Shawn.
And I definitely encourage our listeners to go back and check out that podcast as well. That was a great overview, Peter, and the report again can be accessed on our website at watertowerresearch.com. But certainly worth a listen, investors out there, to get an education on that as well. You brought up credits, and that's critical. That's critical for a lot of these projects to get off the ground. How do you feel about the policy environment in Washington and the impacts that that can be having there? On these issues of credits.
Yeah, absolutely. Very important question. I'd say I feel pretty constructive, actually. But before talking about the policy environment, I just want to stress that the companies that we've looked at in this report, carbon capture is something that could potentially enhance the outlook, but it doesn't mean that these companies have no future without carbon capture. So while parts of the outlook may hinge on policy outcomes, it's not what makes or break the situation for these companies as a whole, if you know what I mean. So the management need to be and are smart about planning their strategies. The strategies need to be durable and ready to adapt to any kind of political environment because policies can change. So at the same time, as I said before, we should not underestimate how much the burden of higher cost and policy uncertainty might be carried by customers who are seeking to abate carbon, and that means especially the airlines. So, but that said, I think we do have a lot of strong bipartisan support for carbon capture as it relates to ethanol, sustainable aviation fuel, and you were 100% on there earlier, Shawn, when you talked about the America First, these policies, and the farmers first. You can say as well, you've got a long history of support for rural communities as being one of the least partisan themes. But to put this into more concrete terms, let's just look at Trump's executive orders, and equally important are the people who he nominated or appointed to various positions. So starting with President Trump's National Energy Emergency Executive Order, this lists biofuels, specifically ethanol and aviation fuel, alongside natural gas liquids, oil, and other fuels that share the overarching goal of being reliable, diversified, and affordable. So this gels exactly with Trump's energy dominance strategy, which is not focused on fossil fuels alone. It's an all of the above type strategy with ethanol and sustainable aviation fuel right in there, clear as day. The next thing I'd point to are some of those, key appointments in Trump's administration, and we elaborate on these in the report. So you've got, Doug Burgum, for example, Interior Minister. He is former governor of North Dakota and a big supporter of CCS in the Midwest. We can talk about the Summit Carbon Solutions pipeline later, but this CO2 pipeline would sequester carbon from more than 50 ethanol and SAF plants across the Midwest and sequester carbon in the carbon in North Dakota. So again, Governor Burgum, big supporter of this project for some time now. You've got Lee Zeldin, which is Trump's administrator of the EPA. Zeldin is a former Republican representative from New York, but importantly, he was a member of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus and the Conservative Climate Caucus. Brooke Rollins is another one. She is Trump's pick for agricultural secretary. Just a few days ago, she fielded questions before the Senate's Ag, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee and came across very pro biofuels, although she's also very pro fossil fuels. But in this case, these things can really coexist together because we're talking about the energy strategy here. So kind of a long answer there, Shawn, but I'll throw in one more piece of evidence. a group of senators, both Republican and Democrat, and from across the U.S. Midwest, reintroduced the Farm to Fly Act, and that is designed to accelerate development of sustainable aviation fuel. So, Shawn, I'd say this shows, a clear support for homegrown biofuels as being beneficial for the rural economy and energy security. And again, CCS is a big way to enable even more globally marketable biofuels where the U.S. can be a competitive supplier.
And as you said, this isn't an either or type policy, right? This is, I mean, homegrown biofuels is strategically important. It's economically important, as is our fossil fuel development as well, and especially natural gas. So I think it gets lost a lot of times in this idea that this isn't a highly subsidized solar project or something from 10 years ago. This is about really bolstering the local economies, supporting farmers and rural communities. So it's not like you can't support that and support fossil fuels. So I think it's a challenge in the policy issues because investors are looking at it and saying, as we've seen in many of the stocks, they've been, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, with a lot of the companies in the sector.
Mhm.
Where, I think it's certainly time to start picking through some of these. And to that point, let's drive it home for investors and let's talk about some of the companies that are actually pursuing CCS ethanol projects that you've cited in your report.
Okay. Okay. Great, Shawn. I'll start with a few of these infrastructure projects because those are going to help enable some of the CCS for some of these companies. Not necessarily all of them. Some of them are fully integrated. For example, Gevo. But we discuss several of these in detail in the report. But the biggest and potentially most promising is the Summit Carbon Solutions CCS project. This project proposes 2,500 miles of CO2 pipeline across 5 states in the Midwest. The plan would be to capture up to 18 million tons of CO2 annually from more than 50 ethanol refineries across these states, as I mentioned. And you would transport that and sequester it underground in North Dakota. Now, in terms of moving these projects forward, the company has had a lot of success, and it's basically green-lighted in 4 out of 5 states. The holdout for the time being is South Dakota, so there's a lot of interest there right now. Tallgrass Energy has converted an existing natural gas pipeline route to a CO2 transport service. That project will begin operating in the second half of this year, collecting CO2 from Green Plains ethanol refineries in Nebraska and sequestering in Wyoming. At the same time, I have to highlight that there were 2 major projects that were actually canceled the last 2 years, and this does highlight some of the uncertainty. With these pipeline proposals, you can have very intense conflicts between project developers and landowners. And the 2 projects that were canceled, the 10 million ton Heartland Greenway project and the 12 million ton Wolf Carbon Solutions project. Wolf was tied into some of the low carbon ethanol strategy for Archer Daniels Midland. It's possible that could still come back, and you could see, Wolf reapplying, but we have to wait and see on that. But now, specifically for the companies, we've got 8 write-ups here within the report, and we detail the operations and the CCS strategies specifically for the listed ethanol producers. Putting those in alphabetical order, we've got Ametis, ticker AMTX, Alto, ticker ALTO, Archer Daniels Midland, ticker ADM, Gevo, ticker GEVO, Green Plains, ticker GPRE, Lanzatech, ticker LNZA, and Rex American Resources, ticker REX. There's too much detail, to go through all of these right now, but so I'd refer investors to report for that. But I just point out that 2 of the companies have CCS capacity, which is operational today, and those are ADM and Gevo. We have talked about Gevo's Red Trail acquisition in North Dakota, landing them in the CCS business, and Gevo's NZ1 SAF project in South Dakota. I'll highlight here as well. It's potentially linked into that Summit carbon pipeline. Green Plains will have a CCS project online and generate income from that project by the second half of this year. They're hooked into that Tallgrass Energy CCS project, which I highlighted before in Nebraska. And Green Plains has just to show you there's real money here. Green Plains has guided for around $130 million annual earnings coming from the CCS project. As for Ametis, Alto, LanzaTech and Rex, the CCS projects for these companies are all more in the planning and development stage. In a couple of months, we hope to invite some of these companies to join us for a related WTR symposium to further elaborate on their strategies. So really stay tuned for that. Finally, we also did discuss the strategy for Carbon TerraVault, which is a subsidiary of California Resources. That project is not servicing ethanol refineries because it's in California, not a lot of that to service out there, but includes at least one renewable gasoline facility and multiple renewable natural gas facilities, among other customers. So that, Shawn, is an enormous project that so far has potential storage for about 325 million tons of CO2.
Well, thank you, Peter. That was a great overview. We're going to leave it there. And again, I'd encourage everybody to take a look at the report at www.watertowerresearch. And thanks again for your insights, Peter, on ethanol carbon capture and storage report. And today, again, you can access this for the prior one. I'd encourage you to go back and look at a couple of the other topical podcasts that we've hosted with you. This is a great overview, including some of the more recent ones on GEVO as well. So, I encourage all investors to take a look at those podcasts and take a listen. Thank you for listening, everybody, today, and have a great day. Thank you, Peter.
Hey, thanks, Shawn.